everybody, this is GM Jesse Kraai, and today I'd like to talk about the Chesslecture training guide designed for players between 1400 and 1600. Now, the position in front of you is taken from a game I played back in 2003 against Armenian IM Andranik Matikosyan. And whilst I talk, I'd like you to first try to come to a qualitative evaluation of the position before you decide what white should play. Now, what is a qualitative evaluation? A qualitative evaluation is essentially an educated guess as to who stands better and why. That is, we're not going to even begin calculating specific variations. Calculation would lead us to what we can call a concrete evaluation, evaluation versus a qualitative one. Now, most beginners' minds jump directly into the study of concrete variations. They're looking at what's threatening what and all this stuff when they're faced with a position like this at the board. And this tendency disturbs the mind's need to understand the position qualitatively or positionally. The mind needs this type of understanding because without it, one isn't able to really know what to look for in the variations. Let me put it this way. Losing oneself in calculation before having a positional sense of what's going on is like going on a quest for treasure in a dark forest without having a map of the place. And the treasure which the beginner is looking for is almost invariably some form of material gain. And this prologue brings me to the simple art I wish someone had taught me as a kid, namely the art of talking to your pieces. So as an example, let's try to apply this art to the present position. The first thing I like to do when I look at a position, I just want to think about it qualitatively, is to weigh the quality of the pieces against their counterparts. So let's just start with the rooks. Now, it's very clear that the rooks, white's rooks, are much stronger than the black rooks. The rook on e5 and a7, both of those are very discoordinated, whereas the white rooks control the open d line and are touching a number of very important squares and might be able to enter those squares in some kind of decisive way in the future. However, when we look at just the rook's current plight, they're stopped at the moment from entering d6 by the bishop on f8, and what black has done is he's created a kind of wall for the rooks with the bishop on d7 so that they can't enter into d8. Of course, that means that black's pieces are tied to defending the d7 point, which is a little bit awkward. In any case, I think what we can say first of all is that the rooks are very beautiful for white and much stronger than their black counterparts. Now let's move on to the other pieces. When we look at the knight on f5, that looks like a very strong piece. And the first thing I guess we can say is that if black ever takes us, we'll be able to take back with the g-pawn and have two very strong connected pass pawns. Whereas if he leaves us there, that knight will continue to exert a lot of influence, particularly around the black king and the center. So that knight has to be stronger than really the counterpart, which is trying to control it, the bishop on f8. Okay? Same thing can be said really with the bishop on c4. It's very strong, controls a lot of squares, and is doing much better than its counterpart on d7, which is really kind of a pawn in this sense, in that it's very passive, trying to block my rooks. Now when we look at the knights, I think it's fair to say that both players' knights, the knight on c3 and the knight on f6, aren't their best pieces. The knight on c3 is blocked by the pawn on c6 to sujit, or dominated by that pawn. And so right away, one thing that we do when we do qualitative analysis is when we sense that weakness in white's position, the knight on c3, that will become a focal point for us in the future, namely, how can I improve the position of that knight? That's going to be part of any game plan we have. Okay, now let's take a look at black's position a little bit more carefully. the things that are positive about his position is that he doesn't have any overwhelming weaknesses in terms of pawn weaknesses, and the two bishops, whilst not really an offensive force at this point, are doing quite well in terms of being able to control both colors in the board, the dark and the white, and those are preventing my rooks from penetrating. Also, when we look at the position, we can see that the pawns on the king side are a little bit funny. And one thing I realized here is that what my opponent was probably thinking of and dreaming of, because he's a King's Indian player, and King's Indian players are basically born to suffer, and but they suffer quite well, the best of them anyway. And I think what he was thinking was that when I move my knight, which I might want to do to say to a square like d6, depending on the circumstances, he's going to really be thinking about taking on g4 and then sacking on g4, probably with the knight, to give him two passed pawns in exchange for this piece for two pawn sacrifice. And it's always going to be a little bit unclear how good that is. But I don't like that threat hanging over me. So right away, in terms of the pawns there, that's a concern that we have for the qualitative evaluation, that I don't really want to see a knight landing on g4 and him busting up the pieces and somehow coming to life. Because the characteristic now for black is that he is basically in a bit of a stranglehold, and he's committed himself to a passive defense, but he's got a kind of fortress thing going on. And so the next thing in terms of the fortress, in terms of understanding the position qualitatively, is I would like to trade off, in particular, one of those bishops. Any one of those trades would give me access to the squares d6, d7, or d8 for the rooks, and that's really what I'm looking for. Because at the moment, black is just holding on. Now, okay, let's talk about how the game happened here. First thing I thought of was maybe I'd like to play bishop b3. The point of that move would be that my knight could potentially go knight d6, knight c4, and then I'd be able to break him down, because the rook would have to move and I can play e5, and the knight on f6 has to go away, and I win the bishop on d7, thus breaking him down. So bishop b3 also gets out of the way of anything like b5 or rook c5, so it's also comfortable in that way. So that was kind of the first thought, just in terms of improving my position. But instead I came up with a bit of a wacky idea that really I think was garnered from my having studied the Polgar books of Mate in Twos. And one of the things about this section in the training guide is that I've recommended a large number of these problems, and I know from practical experience that many people will become frustrated with these problems and give them up, thinking that they don't have any practical value because they all seem like positions where the side with overwhelming material advantage should win anyway. Well, of course they should win anyway, but that's not the point of the problems. The point is to identify patterns. And it was here that I saw a cute little pattern. What I saw was that if I were to take here, and black took back with the king, I would have a mate, bishop f7. Kind of a funny mate. The kind of thing I don't think I would have even looked for if I hadn't been studying those problems. But the problem, at least at the moment, is if I play gh and he plays king h7, then I've ruined my pawn structure and the knight is unstable on f5. So these things led me to a bit of one of the stranger moves I'm proud of. And in a lot of ways, I think it was how this Polgar book really helped me to get my first GM norm, which was achieved in this tournament. And that was this move, bishop g8. So the point is that the king can't go back to h7 now. So now I am actually threatening pawn takes h5. So pawn takes h5, and the knight can't take back because the bishop on d7 is hanging. And at the same time, bishop g8 highlights, I think, psychologically for black how tight he is. He can't move the knight from f6 because I'll take the bishop on d7, and the main point of that would be that my rooks invade when I get that trait. So that's why I knew already that it was always a good thing if I, could trade off one of my pieces. Okay, so in this game, my opponent played the right move, I think, which was h4. If he takes on g4, he basically is giving me more possibilities on the h file. And we see there an idea of like rook h6 looming, another idea of a mate, a Polgar-style mate, study-like mate. So he plays h4, and now I do what I intended, bishop b3. So now I'm threatening knight d6, c4, and at the same time, I've achieved something very important, in particular, if nothing else, just psychologically, and that is the elimination of this threat of playing h takes g and then later making some kind of King's Indian style sacrifice. So I basically made this positional move, but with the help of a tactic, I was able to secure a bigger positional gain than if I had played just bishop b3 directly. And one of the reasons I showed this problem was really to demonstrate the value of tactics with your positional understanding. Okay, let's look at how the game progressed. He played bishop c5, which is very logical. And now I played knight d6. So now I have the threat of knight c4 and e5, thus undermining the bishop on d7. So my opponent played bishop e6. Okay, so I took, and now I just came back because I had achieved my strategical aim. Now my rooks, it's very important to see, have gained significantly in their strength. Now they have access all the way to d8. So my opponent played rook a8, and now I just did what was just a logical maneuver here. I played knight e2, and the very simple idea is I want to improve the position of my knight. My knight on c3 was the worst, and for many moves now I've been trying to imagine a way to get it into the game. My opponent played rook e8, and now I played just a very basic move, rook d3. And a move like this really kind of highlights the problems with black being passive. And that is, I can make a building move, rook d3. And rook d3, what does it do? I might wish to play my rook to b3 in some variations, and I in particular don't want to be molested at any given point with bishop b4. But the main point is that black can't really do anything at this point, so I can steadily improve before I go after black. My opponent plays rook b8. Now a simple move, knight d6. Now notice, this highlights a little bit the problem of the rook on e8. It can't really move to the e file because then I can push e5. Maybe not even now, but I can do it on the next move as well. And when I push e5, then the knight could conceivably have some difficulties as well as the king. Another thing I think should be mentioned earlier is because I have the pawn majority on the king side, that means that my king security is better and his is worse. And that's just a key fact I've seen through many practical games, is that extra pawn will often give you the decisive attack in various situations. And even though the queens are off in this position, an attack is definitely possible. So he plays rook e7, and I just come back, knight c4. So my knight's left f5, which seems very strange, but on c4 it's doing quite a lot. And what my idea was that now, instead of my e2 knight coming to d4 and have this reduplicating problem where the knights touch each other in f5, first I'll just bring this guy to c4, where he does a lot of things. He's touching e5, he's massaging these pawns in b6 and a5, and now my knight, when it comes to d4, can really think about coming into f5. So my opponent played king f7, and I played knight d4. Threatening c6, threatening knight f5, so my opponent had to take. Rook takes. And basically, this is the strategical culmination of the first position we had, where we understood kind of what white was on about before he went in plunging into a bunch of complications. And that's the biggest thing I see beginners making a mistake, is they try to do something in positions like the first ones we began with, when really White has to be very precise in simply first stopping black from doing things, then slowly coming to the strategical gains that he's understood from a qualitative evaluation of the position. And we see here a position is essentially strategically lost now for black, because now I have access to such beautiful entrance squares like rook to d6, and black can't really do anything about it. So in this position, my opponent, I thought, actually made the best practical attempt and played b5. The point simply being that after pawn takes, knight takes, he's jettisoned a pawn, but at least his rooks now are more open and my knight might be sidelined. Though this position is I think, technically winning for white, and I went on to win that game. So that's the art that I think many players at this level need to learn. The art of talking to one's pieces, understanding what factors need to be appreciated in order to really form a strategical sense of the game. And once you have that strategical sense, then you can look at variations, because then you'll have an idea of what you're trying to accomplish. Okay, so the endgame competency, on this level is very critical. We have the Lucena position and the Philidor position. Both of those form really the bedrock of the rook endgames. And I think at this level, those are really what you need. Just master those, and I think later we'll concentrate more on more technical aspects of the rook endgame. Also, we have the queen versus rook. That's very difficult and really needs to be played out against people, or maybe a computer, some kind of module where you get a sense of that endgame. Okay, what I'm going to leave with here is just the reminder, the admonition that one needs, if one's going to make progress, more than anything else, one needs to study one's own games. One needs to try to understand where one is weak and where one can improve. So in order to appreciate the importance of studying one's games, I thought I'd give an analogy. So at our site, we have two players that have no respect for the linguistic amenity of the article in the English language. The these, the thes, and the a's, like a thing, the thing. They don't like that, and it's something that the Russians just don't seem to appreciate. So, for example, when Eugene Perelstein is talking, he'll say, playing against boy genius, instead of saying playing against the boy genius. Okay? Now, for me, listening to it, it's not a big problem. I can understand what he's saying. But if you imagine he's trying to work on the skills of the English language, then, that would be a thing to look at, to try to improve. And little things like that are the things that we need to look for in our own games. What's somehow problematic and why isn't it being fixed? So, as a chess example, one thing that I'll notice is when I hear other people lecturing, I'll often sense where their difficulties psychologically lie, and those psychological difficulties often surround their own lack of competence in some kind of area. Okay, so for example, Bill Pascal today just put out a lecture that was very interesting concerning his experiences on the white side of the Pirc, or the Pierts. And what I found interesting was he was playing a very conservative plan against the Pierts, which is totally fine, usually called the classical system. And he was getting positions that were just a little bit better for white, and oftentimes they were endgame style positions. And he would be saying things like, am I really going to be able to win from this symmetrical position? And basically doubting the fact that white had anything substantial, and doubted his own ability in converting that kind of advantage. And what was interesting to me about that was that that's the kind of work that one has to do, where is one wiggling around psychologically? What kind of positions are just driving a person up the wall? And that kind of knowledge will help you to understand either the positions you are unwilling to play, like apparently Bill will never play the classical against the Pirc anymore, or you can say to yourself, look, this is a position, a type of position where I don't feel comfortable, and I have to somehow learn to play a slow, methodical game as would be necessary against something where you get just a small advantage, and that is very critical, because chess in general might just be a small advantage. There might be no way for white to get some kind of crushing advantage. A small advantage might be the modest kind of attainment we have to content ourselves with. And that kind of psychological worming about is very important, not only for you to see in your own games, but it'll help you understand where other people are coming from in their own difficulties. And someone with some experience can notice that not only when Bill's talking, but the kind of positions he's successful in. And someone preparing for him will deliberately go into a symmetrical position just so that the worm that's eating away at Bill can do its own work by itself. So, this is GM Jesse Kraai, hoping you've enjoyed this. We'll return for the next installment of 1600 to 1800. Bye-bye.